The Texas Rangers, the heroes, their adventures, the legacy. The truth about what was next in the real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the forests were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
As America moved westward during the 19th century, a front line of armed men defended advancing settlements against Indian attacks and other threats. Texas was no exception. There, however, a unique breed of volunteers signed on to protect the settlers. It was said that these men could ride like Mexicans, trail like Indians, shoot like Tennesseans, and fight like the devil. Their unmatched record of service helped tame the West and made them legends. These men were the Texas Rangers.
Various are the excitements of a ranger's life. The wild foray, the secret scout, the ambuscade, the exciting skirmish, and the hazardous yet enticing expeditions in which we were so frequently engaged lent a fascination, a romance to our existence, which those who drag out a commonplace life in a dull city never dream of. Samuel C. Reed, Texas Ranger, 1847.
The Texas Rangers are unique in the annals of Western history in that they're a state police force mostly devoted to frontier defense, that they go to the most exposed areas of the state's boundaries, that they battle the enemies of the state's inhabitants. And because of this fierce combat that they're engaged in, that they establish a legend of law enforcement that everyone else has admired ever since.
In many ways, the Texas Ranger was the prototypical Hollywood cowboy. He was a man of few words. He was a man of action. He represented a law in a lawless land. But unlike the Hollywood cowboys who always express regret at the death of even the vilest villain, Texas Rangers regarded the deaths of their adversaries with a studied indifference.
A ranger was absolutely fearless. You can describe him many ways, but that epitomizes a ranger, fearlessness.
No man in the wrong can stand up against a fella that's in the right and keeps it coming. Bill McDonald, Ranger Captain.
The story of the Texas Rangers in the 19th century is the ultimate Western tall tale, except for one key difference. It's true.
Well, the ranging tradition is not particular just to Texas. I like to think that we Texans just improved on it, but it goes back to England, back to the 1400s. There were rangers there who protected the king's forests.
And that tradition of sending a person out to take care of a fairly open spot of ground and settle trouble that might be found anywhere he found it, that was a tradition that came over the Atlantic. And that was a tradition that ended up in the southern part of the United States.
In the 1820s, Southerners brought this tradition to Texas, then a remote colony of Mexico. This new land was made for ranging.
In Texas, you're always confronted with distance. It's just a hell of a long way from point A to point B. And at any point along that route, your life is in danger.
The only way you could provide any sort of protection was to range the frontier, which meant a patrol. You had to actually ride along there and look for signs of the Indians.
The Indians that threatened the new Texas settlers the most were the Comanches.
The Comanches were used to simply being able to come in and make lightning-quick raids all across the Texas frontier in the Spanish and the Mexican periods. So the Comanches could move in within minutes, could effect their raid, grab their goods, and be gone.
The Rangers were organized to meet this foe because some sort of permanent frontier defense had to be established.
Stephen F. Austin, the most prominent colonist, made the first official reference to Rangers in Texas.
I will employ 10 men to act as Rangers for the common defense. The wages I will give the said 10 men is $15 a month, payable in property. Stephen F. Austin, 1823.
That set up not only the ranging tradition, but it also helped establish the independent mindset of the Texian settler and his citizen soldier response to threats and intolerable situations.
Living under Mexican dictator Santa Anna became an intolerable situation for the Texans by 1835. Revolution was near and more Rangers were needed.
A provisional government was beginning to organize, and they realized the need for a force that was not quite militia, not quite regular army, and the Rangers really pretty much be down the middle.
Paid $1.25 a day, these Rangers were organized as a volunteer force and would remain as such for most of the 19th century.
They furnished their own horses, they furnished their own weapons, they found their own food, they elected their own officers, and they were the kind of men who served from 3 to 6 months ordinarily and brought law and order to the state.
Their leader was Robert McAlpin Williamson, the first of many distinctive, if unlikely, Ranger commanders.
Better known in Texas lore as Three-Legged Willie, because he had polio as a boy, and it bent his knee permanently, and he had to wear a peg leg from the knee to the ground, an outlandish character.
I understand that he still cut a lively jig and never let that get in the way of his life as a Ranger.
He stirred up the Revolution as a writer. He was called Patrick Henry of the Texas Revolution.
Fellow citizens of Texas, liberty or death should be our determination. And let us one and all unite to protect our country from all invasion. Robert M. Williamson, July 4, 1835.
When the Siege of the Alamo broke out, the Rangers were about the only institution in place to try to respond to the immediate threat of Santa Anna's invasion and occupation of San Antonio.
After the fall of the Alamo and the massacre at Goliad, every Texan, it seemed, was on the run from advancing Mexican forces. Every Texan, that is, except Rangers.
The Rangers lagged behind, protecting the families until they could pack their goods and move on east.
Though Texas won its independence at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836, the fledgling republic would remain embattled.
The Mexicans and the Comanches and the Rangers realized that they were fighting for the existence of their cultures in Texas. There could be only one winner. So there were only two rules. One, winner take all. Two, there were no rules.
And those were the perfect conditions for the Ranger legend to be born. In order for the new republic to prosper, Texas and its Rangers had to establish dominance over a foe perhaps more feared than the Mexican army, the Comanche Indians.
The Lords of the South Plains, they were called, and that's a name they richly deserved. The finest light cavalry in the world.
The Comanche was very mobile, took great pride in his horsemanship, in his warlike nature, and his fighting abilities, which considerable.
Among their feats, one astonished me. Every young man is able to drop his body upon the side of his horse, effectively screened from his enemies. He will hang whilst his horse is at full speed, carrying his bow, shield, and lance. George Catlin, artist.
The Comanches would meet their match in a new Ranger leader, John Coffee Hayes, also known as Captain Jack.
Captain Jack Hayes was probably the Texas Ranger who began the Ranger legend in Texas and across the United States.
Like Three-Legged Willie before him, Hayes was not an obvious choice to lead the Rangers.
John Coffee Hayes, if you ever met him on the street, you would pass him by. Small man, very ill-framed man, who had killer eyes. And it's the eyes that everybody says they noticed.
Hayes had large and brilliant hazel eyes, which are restless in conversation and speak a language of their own, not to be mistaken. Samuel C. Reed, Texas Ranger.
He was a small man, but he made up for it in a indomitable spirit and a sense of toughness that the Indians greatly respected.
As did the Rangers, Hayes gained their respect by teaching them how to fight on the range.
One Ranger talked about how he took him out and made him shoot at boards, ride up the pistols and fire at the board, learn how to duck down behind a horse, and literally did one of the first Ranger training sessions probably ever on record.
Hayes' muster rolls reveal the kind of men who became Rangers in the 19th century. Though they came from various walks of life and different ethnic backgrounds, Rangers shared an essential core.
The qualities necessary in a genuine Ranger were a fleet horse, an eye that could detect the trail, a power of endurance that defied fatigue, and the faculty of looking through the double sights of his rifle with a steady arm. Nelson Lee, Texas Ranger.
Captain Jack's Rangers would take on the Comanches at a time when Texan-Indian relations were at their worst.
The pivotal moment in Texas Comanche relations came in 1840. There was a new president of the Texan Republic, Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, whose Indian policy was very aggressive in the negative sense.
Lamar, desirous to expand Texas settlement, boldly moved the Republic's capital from Houston to Austin.
That encroached very heavily on Comancheria, which the Comanches certainly did not appreciate.
After a series of Indian raids, a council attended by several Rangers erupted in violence over stories regarding the mistreatment of white captives. In what became known as the Council House Fight, all the Comanches present were killed.
The Texans sent a Comanche woman north with the word that unless the captives were brought in, that this would be the fate of all Comanches. Well, the Comanches came in all right, but they didn't bring the captives. Hundreds of them descended upon central Texas, marched through the settlements, burning, killing as they went.
But it was near Plum Creek that the Comanches, returning home with their stolen booty, were ambushed by Texan forces, including Captain Jack and the Rangers.
And there a great battle ensued. One of the Comanche leaders was dressed in a top hat and carried an umbrella. Other Comanches wore dresses that they had stolen from the white settlements. And while this is humorous, the fight turned out to be no laughing matter for the Comanches. They suffered many casualties, far more than they could afford. And the battle at Plum Creek ended Comanche raids deep into the heart of the Texas settlement. But it was only the beginning of a long series of wars.
Those wars taught Captain Jack that in order to defeat the Comanches decisively, the Rangers would have to fight like them.
In fact, they really taught the Texas Rangers in a way that the Rangers had to adapt and get good at horseback warfare too.
The vaunted Kentucky long rifle, although amazingly accurate, was almost impossibly cumbersome for a man of horse.
In the heat of battle, most Rangers would have to dismount to perform the life-threatening tasks of firing and reloading their long rifles.
What made the Comanches particularly fearsome adversaries was their ability to get off about 12 of these arrows during the period of time it would take a Ranger to fire one shot.
What Hayes needed was a new weapon with which to fight the Comanches, and he found it, the Colt Patterson revolver.
This is the Colt Patterson 5-shot 36 caliber revolver, the first really effective repeating weapon. It was acquired by Captain Jack Hayes to arm his Texas Rangers, and it changed the complexion of frontier warfare entirely.
With this 5-shot revolver, the Ranger could stay mounted and keep up with the Comanche, take the fight to the Comanche.
Hayes' first recorded use of Colt revolvers against the Comanches took place while he was surveying at Enchanted Rock in 1841.
He didn't know it at the time, but that was the worst possible place he could have gone because this mountain was sacred to the Comanches. That really annoyed them, that he was atop their sacred mountain, this surveyor, this ranger, this hated white devil. There may have been as many as 100 Indians at Enchanted Rock, all after Jack Hayes.
As the Indians advanced, Hayes discharged his rifle, and then seizing his 5-shooter, he felled them on all sides, thus keeping them off till he could reload. In this manner, he defended himself for 3 long hours until his men arrived just in time to save him. Samuel C. Reed.
Whether it happened or it happened as dramatically as it's been depicted, quien sabe, who knows? But it certainly is a moment that's forever etched in the lore of the Republic and the Colt Patterson and the Texas Rangers.
The legend of the Rangers and their Colts grew after an encounter with the Comanches at Bandera Pass in 1844.
The Comanches charged at the Rangers, expecting the Rangers to dismount, to reload, to fire again. Except the Rangers didn't dismount. They pulled out the Patterson revolvers. Hayes yelled, "Charge," and into the middle of them they went. The Comanches were more than amazed. They were shocked. One of the Indians said, "I will not fight Jack Hayes no more, for he has a shot for every finger on his hand."
The Comanche called him in one of their wonderfully long names, a man who it is very bad luck to get in a fight with because devils side with him.
The rise of Devil Jack and the Texas Rangers meant the inevitable decline of the Comanche Nation, but not before the Rangers adopted more Comanche tactics.
They adopted their stealth tactics. They adopted their techniques of riding, and they borrowed something else. They borrowed their terror.
The Rangers would make terror their most effective weapon when they fought in the Mexican War. The annexation of Texas to the United States in 1845 sparked the Mexican War. Up until then, the Rangers had earned a hard-won reputation within Texas as fearless fighters against Indian and Mexican raiders. But it was during the Mexican War that the Rangers' legend would spread far beyond the state's borders. Fighting alongside their new countrymen against an old enemy, the Rangers' controversial actions would brand them Los Diablos Tejanos, the Devil Texans. The Rio Grande. That's Mexico on the left and Texas on the right. There was a time when these simple facts were fighting words.
During the Republic years of Texas, the border was not adequately defined between Texas and Old Mexico. Mexico recognized the Nueces River. Texas recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border. And in a sense, the area in between then became known as the Nueces Strip, which meant it belonged to Texas, and it also belonged to Mexico, and it belonged to nobody, and it became a source of contention.
And in fact, this dispute was one of the prime causes leading to the outbreak of war between the United States and Mexico once the U.S. annexed Texas in 1845.
When war was finally declared between the United States and Mexico in May of 1846, the call immediately went out for volunteer forces to be organized and support the standing regular United States Army.
General Zachary Taylor especially needed men who knew the enemy. Enter the Texas Rangers.
Hayes's Rangers have come, their appearance never to be forgotten. Not any sort of uniforms, but well-mounted and doubly well-armed. Each man has 1 or 2 Colt revolvers besides ordinary pistols, a sword and a rifle. The Mexicans are terribly afraid of them. General Ethan Allen Hitchcock.
Ranging companies participated in the war, much as a regular militia, and they became legendary in the occupying army under Zachary Taylor.
Most prominent in the Ranger legend is Samuel Hamilton Walker.
Walker organizes the only company of volunteers to participate in the first 2 battles of the Mexican War. Walker's service is enough to impress Taylor and get Walker a commission in the United States military. Probably one of the only Rangers actually to be offered a commission in the United States Regular Forces.
I think of Sam Walker as the thinking man's Texas Ranger. He was rough and rowdy, sure, but he was more than that.
Walker was also the co-designer of a world-famous firearm.
This is the famous Colt Walker 44 caliber 6-shot revolver. It was designed by Sam Walker and Sam Colt. The improvement of the Walker over the Patterson revolver is fairly obvious. Much more powerful, much more dependable mechanism, and it was much more accurate.
Walker died with his namesake in hand.
Sam Walker dies in the last major battle of the Mexican War. He dies weeks before the shipment of Colt Walker pistols arrives for his regiment, and dies before the Walker or the Colt pistol becomes an established part of the United States military arsenal.
Throughout the Mexican War, the Ranger legend grew, the Texans dazzling both friend and foe with their battlefield exploits.
Those fearless horsemen vied with each other in approaching the very edge of danger. Their proximity occasionally provoked the enemy's fire, but the Mexicans might as well have attempted to bring down swallows as those racing daredevils. Luther Giddings, 1st Ohio Volunteers.
Embodying the Ranger spirit was William Bigfoot Wallace.
His personal exploits were so outlandish that he became the archetypal Ranger. At one battle, the mule he was riding bolted and charged right into Mexican lines. The Mexicans, of course, thought that this man was utterly fearless to have ridden in alone. He eventually cut his way out, but that's the sort of scrape that he commonly got into and out of.
Like Bigfoot, other Rangers weren't afraid to go anywhere. Their bravery and familiarity with the enemy helped distinguish them as scouts and spies. At these roles, none was better than Ben McCullough.
Ben McCullough's greatest accomplishment during the war was his remarkable scout prior to the Battle of Buena Vista. He rode 30 miles south of Taylor's position to identify the specific location of Santana's Mexican army.
He was actually credited with going far further than anybody thought a man could, even in terms of speed for a day, much less in terms of where he might be observed by an opposing army.
To avoid being observed while crossing enemy lines, McCullough disguised himself as a Mexican.
He always speculated that because Texans were generally dressed in the wide-brim hats and the serapes, that the Mexican sentries probably mistook them for common vaqueros.
The Battle of Buena Vista climaxed General Taylor's northern campaign.
Although the victory was Taylor's, the information that made that victory possible was produced by Ben McCullough and his Rangers.
But in spite of the heroics of McCullough, Wallace, and Walker, the Rangers were proving to be a little too rough and ready for General Rough and Ready Taylor himself.
There was an ongoing love-hate relationship between General Taylor and his rowdy Texas Rangers. On the day of battle, they were indispensable, but when they weren't actually fighting, they tended to be more trouble than they were worth.
The mounted men from Texas have scarcely made one expedition without unwarrantably killing a Mexican. There is scarcely a form of crime that has not been reported to me as committed by them. General Zachary Taylor.
These are people that came with grudges and big chips on their shoulders.
Most Rangers held grudges against the Mexicans ever since the Texas Revolution 10 years earlier. They never forgot the Battle of the Alamo in which Ben McCullough's close friend, David Crockett, was killed. Other Rangers, such as Bigfoot Wallace, lost family at the Goliad Massacre, and many, including Sam Walker, were survivors of bloody border raids during the Republic years.
The Texas Rangers' perspective on the Mexican War was that here's a chance for us to pay some of those rascals back.
A terrible story in Mexico City where one of the street urchins ran up and stole the handkerchief out of the pocket of a ranger, who proceeded to pull out a pistol and blow him away. And that was a kind of instant retribution that one could expect.
Their adversaries gave them the name Los Diablos Tejanos, the Texas Devils. This suggested fierceness and the unforgiving quality of the Texas Rangers,
which was terrible for the population, but for the guerrillas, the Mexican guerrillas, who were equally as ruthless and devilish in their campaign, it was the right means to end the situation.
The notoriety of Los Diablos Tejanos spread far beyond the battlefield.
The Mexican War was among the first where correspondents rode with the Army and sent back dispatches depicting the battles. These journalists were seeking sensational stories, and what better copy than these exotic Texas Rangers?
The Texas Rangers appear to have a dreadful reputation, even in our own armies, while to the Mexicans, they must seem the very incarnation of cruelty. The New York Herald, May 1846.
They became legendary in an almost scornful way, because even Taylor couldn't control the Texans. And after the initial fighting was over, numerous atrocities were committed against the Mexican citizenry. And Taylor finally had to send the Texas Rangers packing back home out of the path of the Mexicans.
Although the American Army would never admit it, probably the reason which they were successful was the Texas Rangers. Because the Army needed its lines of communications open, it was the Texas Rangers who kept it open. The Army needed someone to keep the guerrillas off of them, it was the Texas Rangers who kept the guerrillas off. It was the Texas Rangers that did the dirty things that the Army didn't want to do, and as a result of that, they kept the bloodshed low, and it was a much more remarkable military penetration into Mexico with the Rangers than it would ever have been without the Rangers.
If there was one Ranger who knew well the legacy of his men's service during the war, it was John "Rip" Ford.
He used to write letters of condolence to families back home of sons and fathers who had died in combat. And he always signed them R.I.P., rest in peace. The wry, humorous Texas Rangers gave him this as a nickname, rest in peace, Rip Ford.
The end of the Mexican War also marked the close of the Jack Hayes era in Texas Ranger history.
After the Mexican War, with no Mexicans to fight, the Indians relatively subdued, Hayes joined other 49ers who were flocking to California. Jack Hayes found no gold, but in his spare time, he did manage to found the city of Oakland, California.
There would be other illustrious Rangers after Captain Jack. Some of them would make their name in the next great era in Ranger history. The Texas Rangers would make the transition from frontier defenders to lawmen in the next great era of their history. It began in the years after the Civil War.
The 1870s was probably the wildest time in 19th century Texas because the Indians were still a problem. In the first half of the 1870s, the outlaws kept the Rangers well occupied in the second half.
To deal with these threats, Governor Richard Koch approved the reorganization of the Rangers into two units, one of which was the Frontier Battalion.
Well, the Frontier Battalion was created in 1874 to protect the frontier of Texas. Their primary goal was Indian fighting and protection of the frontier against Indian fighting.
The Frontier Battalion was comprised of 6 companies of 75 men each. Their leader was John B. Jones, a man right out of the Captain Jack mold.
Major Jones presents an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, he was a very fastidious man, prim and careful dresser. His men, though, claimed that in a firefight, he was an absolute devil.
His method was to trail these Indians home if you could, trail them till you caught them, till their vigilance kind of relaxed, and then destroy them.
With small detachment of my command, I found an Indian train in Lost Valley yesterday, overtook them and killed 5, only one known to have escaped. One of my men slightly wounded. John B. Jones, Major, Frontier Battalion.
The land was not a merciful place, and neither were these Rangers. And they were a perfect match for the vastness of the Texas frontier.
Though this land was harsh, it was home to the Rangers.
A ranger camp was a men's place. A ranger camp ordinarily was temporary, without a great deal of comfort because rangers were not people used to comfort.
Here was a scene worthy of the pencil. Men in groups with long beards and mustaches, dressed in every variety of garment, occupied drying their blankets, cleaning and fixing their guns, and some employed cooking at different fires, while others were grooming their horses. A rougher-looking set we never saw. Notwithstanding their outlaw look, there were among them doctors, lawyers, and many a college graduate. Samuel C. Reed, Texas Ranger.
By the mid-1870s, as the Indian problem was beginning to fade in Texas, Texas was really starting to grow. The railroads were moving in, cattle were being pushed north to the market. That brought in new people, and of course, when new people come in, you get more crime.
Increasingly, Major Jones and the Frontier Battalion found themselves in the unaccustomed role of law enforcement officers, tracking down horse thieves, cattle rustlers, bank robbers, a role that they weren't entirely comfortable with in the beginning, but grew to master.
The Frontier Battalion's most notorious catch was Sam Bass.
Sam Bass was a youthful train robber, originally from Indiana, but his family had settled around Denton in North Texas, which is where he began robbing trains.
John Jones's Texas Rangers were soon hot on his heels, and after a series of successful robberies, they managed to infiltrate Sam Bass's gang by capturing one of his men and getting him to act as a spy.
Jim Murphy, the spy, informed Jones to bring his men to Round Rock, where Bass planned his next robbery.
The Rangers heard Bass fire and came from their hiding like shot off a shovel. Ranger Dick Ware shot Bass, giving him a mortal wound. Lying under a tree, helpless, he said, "I guess I'm the man you're looking for. I am Sam Bass." Dan Roberts, Texas Ranger.
He became a legend in Texas by refusing to rat on his compatriots. A man has to live by a code, he said, as he lay dying, and even the Rangers respected Sam Bass for that.
In addition to hunting down outlaws, the Frontier Battalion found itself settling feuds and other civic matters.
A problem would develop in a town, it looked like somebody might be lynched or a mob was about to take over. The Rangers would come in, not so much to solve the problem as at least to stabilize the problem until it could be solved.
With impartiality and firmness, Major Jones and the Rangers handled such delicate matters with frequent success. But the El Paso Salt War in 1877 was a notable exception.
It is the only recorded example of a Texas Ranger detachment ever surrendering in the face of the enemy.
The Rangers became involved in the war when they arrested the disputed owner of the local salt mines, Charles Howard, for the murder of rival Juan Cardis. The Rangers, however, gave up Howard to outraged Mexicans who killed him before their own firing squad. The Rangers learned 3 costly lessons that day in El Paso.
Never surrender to a mob, never hand over a prisoner to a mob, and regardless of the odds, keep fighting.
In spite of the El Paso Salt War, the Frontier Battalion served with distinction until it was disbanded in 1891, the same year Major Jones died. The unit's demise came not because of the leader's death, but because with the end of Indian hostilities, it was the frontier that really died. The other Ranger unit created at the same time as the Frontier Battalion was called the Special Force. It patrolled the border between Texas and Mexico.
There was no army guarding it to speak of. Texas Rangers were all there were, and the cattle raids, the outlaw raids, the Indian raids coming back and forth across the border were simply beyond belief.
Is Captain McNelly coming? We are in trouble. 5 ranches burned by disguised men near La Parra last week. Answer. Sheriff John McClure, Nueces County.
Captain Leander McNelly was the leader of the Special Force.
McNelly was one of the most complex Rangers we can imagine. Here's a man who's an ex-divinity student. Here's a man who's a tubercular.
In fact, he died very soon after his great exploits of tuberculosis. In fact, a lot of the times he had to travel in a wagon, in a bed they had made up in the wagon. He couldn't ride.
The way Captain McNelly fixed control over this bunch can't be told. I still don't know how he did it, but he did. Here was a man who could tell you what to do and you'd do it, and never have any suspicion that he might be wrong. George Durham, a McNelly Ranger.
These outlaws have been running roughshod over decent folks, burning, plundering, and raiding. They claim to be bigger than the law. It's up to us to see if they're right or wrong. We've got fighting to do, but I'll never send you into a fight. I'll lead you in. Leander McNelly.
The border bandits soon found out that McNelly's Special Force meant business.
Had a fight with raiders, killed 12 and captured 265 beeves. Wish you were here. L.H. McNelly.
In 1875, McNelly caused an international incident with a raid across into Mexico that's come to be known as the Las Cuevas War.
Las Cuevas was the name of an infamous ranch and rustler hideout located just over the border.
The Las Cuevas War was a good demonstration of Captain McNelly's determination to destroy these bandit gangs.
With 30 men, McNelly trailed Mexican rustlers across the Rio Grande illegally. When he attacked the wrong ranch, innocent people were killed.
Which got the whole countryside up in arms, and soon McNelly and his Rangers were being pursued by hundreds of Mexicans, both irregular forces, local citizens, and the Mexican army.
McNelly and his men retreated to the Rio Grande, but defiantly remained on the Mexican side.
At which time, then, you have a unique situation with the U.S. Army, learning what had happened, closing in, telling McNelly to come back.
To Major Alexander, advise Captain McNelly to return at once to this side of the river. If McNelly is attacked by Mexican forces on Mexican soil, do not render him any assistance. Colonel Potter.
When the U.S. Secretary of War suggested to McNelly that he was violating Mexican sovereignty, McNelly told him to go to hell.
With tension mounting, McNelly still refused to leave Mexico.
He then sent a message to the Mexican forces, 100 strong, that were besieging him, that unless they promptly returned the stolen cattle, that he and his Rangers would attack.
Mexicans delivered 65 beeves last evening. Promised more, and the delivery of the thieves. Have just received this assurance from the president of the jurisdiction, L.H. McNelly.
It was a feat without parallel. You can call it an international incident if you wish, but it went a long way towards stopping the outlaw and cattle rustling raids in the Rio Grande Lower Valley.
John Wesley Hardin was the most wanted outlaw of the era. It would take the persistence of a McNelly Ranger to track him down.
Hardin is generally credited as being the greatest killer that ever lived in the West. They say he killed 40 men. Probably not, but he killed more men than any human being should be allowed to.
In 1874, Hardin killed a deputy sheriff. With every lawman after him, he fled Texas.
Texas Rangers never felt limited to state boundaries. They would cross boundaries, particularly if there was a reward on the head of an individual.
To get the $4,000 reward for Hardin's capture, John B. Armstrong, a McNelly Ranger, trailed Hardin across the southeast.
He and other Rangers went to Florida and found Hardin on a train and arrested him. When Hardin saw the guys with the hats and the big guns, he is supposed to have said, "Texas, by God."
Arrested John Wesley Hardin, Pensacola, Florida, this p.m. He had 4 men with him, had some lively shooting, one of their number killed, all the rest captured. Hardin fought desperately, closed in, and took him by main strength. J.B. Armstrong.
Hardin then is brought back to Texas and tried for murder and sentenced to 25 years in Huntsville.
Hardin's capture highlighted the transition made by the Texas Rangers during the 1870s. Starting out as frontier and border defense, they evolved into lawmen by decade's end. A new century beckoned, and with it, new challenges. With the frontier of Texas tamed and the borderland made stable, the Rangers' transition from frontier defense to lawmen was complete. A reorganization in 1901 made it all official. The Rangers were now a state police force, but this change in definition did not mean a change in attitude. Bill McDonald, a Ranger captain of the period, proved that some traditions, like the Rangers themselves, die hard.
Captain Bill McDonald is again another one of the Rangers who helped build the Ranger legend. He is generally accepted as the source of the famous quote, "One riot, one Ranger."
Dallas was the site. A riot was raging. The mayor wired for help. But when the train pulled up to the station, only a single Ranger stepped down. "Where are the rest of your men?" asked the mayor. "Well, there's only one riot, isn't there?" said the Ranger. And it became a metaphor for the strong individualism that represented the Texas Rangers.
While McDonald's Rangers were out creating their legacy, the surviving Rangers of the frontier days gathered to celebrate their own at various reunions throughout Texas.
In later years, every one of them who wrote about his days as a Ranger as the best time of his life. That's what he was proud of.
I felt mighty chesty. For the first time in my life, I had a prime bit of horseflesh between my knees, and that always does something to a man. George Durham, the last of McNelly's Rangers, 1940.
From such memories, the myth and the mystique of the Texas Rangers endure.
The Texas Rangers are a major element of the Texas myth, and maybe just the part of that myth that comes closest to reality.
The Rangers were common people. They were regular folks. They were men of frail stature that became something greater than themselves.
It's that lone individual going up against enormous odds, an ideal, of course, that the Texans hold so dear because of the Alamo and other such incidents in Texas history, that helped make the Texas Rangers beloved.
But this vaunted symbol for many has become an object of scorn for others.
Many people like to depict the Rangers as vicious thugs who operated with a total disregard for due process of law. I think what these people fail to understand is the dynamic of a frontier in which there's no social structure.
Bear in mind that Texas then was surrounded and threatened on all sides, overrun with robbers and murderers who spread everywhere desolation and death. A Texan had no other alternative than to return blow for blow and to demand blood for blood. Nelson Lee, Texas Ranger.
Rangers always thought of themselves as Texans. They always thought of the land of which something that was worth defending, and it never occurred to them that they should do otherwise. Rangers, like all Texans, have a spiritual connection with the land. You simply cannot live in Texas without being affected by the land.
All of western Texas was a real frontier then. And for one who loved nature and God's own creation, it was a paradise on earth. Oh, how I wish I had the power to describe the wonderful country as I saw it then. how happy I am in my old age that I'm a native Texan and saw the grand frontier before it was marred by the hand of man. J.B. Gillette, Texas Ranger.
From their beginnings as an irregular force of volunteers to the eventual elite corps of appointed officers, the Texas Rangers ensured their existence by adapting to the changing scene in the Lone Star State. Regardless of what era they served in, all Texas Rangers share the rarest of legacies, one that is every bit as colorful in reality as it is in myth.